Good afternoon, class. We're going to get back after things, and I want to pick up where we left off. Today we were discussing a little bit about the French Revolution as it becomes increasingly radicalized, starting in the year 1791, continuing into 1792, before reaching really a crescendo in what we refer to as the Reign of Terror, which happens through late 1793. It's about a 9-month period from 1793 into 1794. And so I have talked to you about a lot of these things. I'm just going to click through them, so in case they have benefit to you, you can pause and hang on to them a little longer. We left off today, concluding this slide, we were talking about how essentially the counter-revolution, which were the forces within, both within and outside of France, that were trying to undo the French Revolution, and to borrow a metaphor, they were trying to put the toothpaste back into the tube, and of course that wasn't a very easy thing to do, nor would it be feasible, but nonetheless there were all sorts of forces that were trying to constrain, strangle, or stop the French Revolution. I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but this cartoon here, this is actually a British cartoon at the time, and it was designed to impress upon the British the British public, the people in Britain at the time, of the possible hazards and things they had to fear should the French Revolution spill over out of France into Great Britain. And as you can see, this cartoon is trying to depict the mobocracy and the problems that might come from the masses acting up and becoming powerful. From 1792 to 93, some changes start to happen that are really important. And if we just pause to think of what's happened, let's just recap briefly in 1792. 1791 had been a very busy year. The National Assembly had essentially made good on its promise that it made in the tennis court oath to draft a new constitution. That new constitution had gone into play, but that new constitution was somewhat conservative in the sense that it was not a universal vote. There were property requirements, and you had to be something of a productive and rather well-off member of society to have full political participation. Also in 1791, the countries of Prussia and Austria had come together in the alliance that they agreed to at Pillnitz, which was a decision to invade France. And as I mentioned, this was based on the fact that many people around France were horrified that the French Revolution would become a contagion, that it would spill out beyond France's borders, threaten the aristocratic interests of the aristocracies in neighboring countries, threaten the institution of monarchy, so on and so forth. So for thinking people of the 1790s, the French Revolution was, in fact, a somewhat disquieting specter. And inside of France, the decision by neighboring enemies to consider invading France, of course, had real consequences for the revolution itself. And what happens is there's a real fear, particularly in 92. It seemed at that time as though the revolution might be over. It seemed as though Austria and Prussia were nearing the capital, Paris, that they may be able to essentially put out the fire of the French Revolution. Also, it's also worth noting that the everyday people of France, the masses, the peasants, both the urban and rural poor of France, were increasingly angry and frustrated by the somewhat tame course that the revolution had taken. After all, a lot of these people were hungry. They had seen some of the economic reforms that the National Assembly had put in place, and now the Legislative Assembly, which had been created out of the Constitution of 1791, they saw much to not particularly like. So in September of 92, a radical move begins. The Jacobins essentially establish themselves as the most powerful faction within the Legislative Assembly, that Representative Assembly. The Jacobins, that name sort of calls to attention radicals within France, but the Jacobins were actually still part, for the most part, they were part of the merchant class, and they had a certain regard for the aristocracy of France, and maybe aristocracy isn't the right word, the merchant class of France. But anyway, they are going to get a foothold within the Legislative Assembly, and because they're reading the increasingly restless French public, they advocate for more and more progressive or liberal reforms. And one of the major expressions that this takes is that they enter into the Legislative Assembly and they call a special convention. This becomes known as the National Convention. And the purpose of the National Convention is to fix the problems with the Legislative Assembly and the Constitution of 1791. And specifically, they want voting rights to be expanded. And so what will happen in the formation of this National Convention, the Jacobins control this convention, and they're actually going to decide when they meet in the National Convention to gut the Constitution of 1791. They introduce a universal voting provision, which transforms France from a constitutional monarchy into a republic. And a republic just means a representative democracy, meaning a democracy. People vote for their representatives, and then those representatives serve as a decision-making body. Very similar to what the United States is. We are, in fact, a republic, a representative democracy. So this is going to change. So now France will essentially have its third governmental form in as many years. And at that same time, a radical group takes over in Paris, and they establish a commune, and in many cases, just for the benefit and spectacle of showing their power, they take a number of criminals who had been incarcerated in the Paris prisons, and they execute them in a very public way. Now, the people who are watching are led to believe that these people are all opponents of the revolution. That was only part true. For the most part, these are just people who were in jail, and they must have seemed expendable to the commune leaders. Nonetheless, this sort of roused the excitement of the crowd and further radicalized the population of Paris and Greater France. Now, also, if we recall, in 1791, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI had tried to escape France for the relative refuge and safety of nearby Austria, where Marie Antoinette's family was in power. They were narrowly captured. They almost got away, but they were discovered in eastern France, returned back to Paris, and from that point on, they are watched very closely. Well, since there's now a new government in place in France, this republic, there's no need for a king. Furthermore, there are concerns that if the king does continue to exist and remains in Paris, remains in France, that could possibly give aid to the growing number of countries that have declared war against France. Of course, if they succeeded, these other countries, in toppling France, it stands to reason that Louis XVI would be returned to the throne. France is no longer a monarchy. Louis XVI has tried to escape. There's widespread belief that Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI are still actively engaged in trying to bring rival countries to France, counter-revolutionary elements to France to set back the revolution. So in late 1792, in December, a trial is carried out or is conducted, not a very legitimate one, Louis is determined to be guilty, and he is executed in January of 1793. Here is where the revolution becomes increasingly radical. The sans-culottes, who are a more ragtag faction within the national convention, within this new French Republic, they are now essentially driving the events of the revolution, and they are the truly the mob or the rabble of French society, uneducated, formerly from the lowest ranks of the economy of France. At the same time, all of these countries here have declared war against France, and France has its work cut out for it to try to stem the tide. So what steps do they take? They declare what becomes essentially, amidst the reign of terror, they declare essentially emergency rule. And while France is technically a republic at this time, the urgencies and challenges that France faces are of such tremendous degree and so overwhelming that they establish a committee of public safety. This is essentially for the purposes of making quick and authoritative decisions. The nature of events in France do not allow for dithering and dathering, and so the Committee of Public Safety, this three-person body, is essentially tasked with making all of the urgent decisions. It's during this time Robespierre, who's a critical member of this Committee of Public Safety, he discovers to his own surprise, quote unquote, the virtue of terror, that people being fearful for their lives is a powerful force for behavior and obedience amidst this reign of terror. And so he uses this largely to his advantage. In this 9-month period of the Reign of Terror, there are going to be around 40,000 public executions of people who are deemed in opposition to the revolution. And of course, the irony here is at the end of the Reign of Terror, Robespierre himself will be consumed and will be one of those people who is killed by the revolution. But amidst the Reign of Terror, there are other major changes that happen. The government becomes incredibly heavy-handed and dramatic in the changes it proposes. It essentially outlaws the Catholic Church. In fact, it establishes a new church, establishes the cult of the Supreme Being, which is also referred to later on as the cult of reason. The church, the Notre Dame in Paris, formerly the Catholic church, is turned into a shrine of this new secular faith, this all-important belief in reason, among all other things. The calendar is changed from a 7-day week to a 10-day week. The calendar is further changed to begin with the beginning of the French Revolution, so sort of placing the French Revolution on par with the birth of Jesus. So all these things. Finally, levee and mass is essentially a large-scale draft, a conscription that brings soldiers into the French army, sort of doubles the size of the French military to over 1 million soldiers almost overnight. And so all these changes are just dramatic. They work in some respects. I mean, militarily, France is going to surprisingly acquit itself very well on the battlefield. It allows itself to survive and defeat many of the neighboring countries that are seeking to invade France, and it does very effectively weather this initial storm. In fact, once Napoleon comes in and takes over, he's going to then take the military battles to distant countries. It says 25,000 people executed here. I think that's a very conservative number. It was probably closer to the 40,000 that I said before. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop and we'll pick up tomorrow.